Okay, well, I think we can probably get started now. I want to welcome everyone on the behalf of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archives. I want to thank you all for being here with us today. I'm Richard Bermack, your host. ALBA's mission is to preserve the legacy of the volunteers who fought to defend Spanish Republic against a fascist takeover, and after the war, they dedicated their lives to the struggle for social justice. If you are joining for our event for the first time, be sure to check out our website for more information. You'll find the links to our website in the chat, and be sure to sign up for our quarterly publication, The Volunteer. Today, we are pleased to present the program honoring labor journalist Art Shields. Art went to Spain to cover the international brigades for the Daily Worker. He was captured, imprisoned, and executed. Nancy Wallach and Josie Urich, ALBA board members, are going to talk about Art's amazing career and the important stories he covered, including interviews with Sacco Vanzetti, Big Bill Haywood, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, William Z. Foster, the poet Carl Sandburg, just to mention a few. You can read his autobiography, On the Battle Lines, 1919 to 1939. Nancy and Josie, to find out more about him. Nancy and Josie are working on other ALBA programs. Today, we're going back in history of the 1920s and 30s, when the labor movement was front page news. Labor had their own news syndicate, the Federated Press, with reporters like Art. That was a time when people proudly identified themselves as workers, engaged in the class struggle. The labor movement was a major part of that struggle, and labor journalists were the banner carriers. Labor reporters saw their role not just as covering the news, but as political organizers and activists. Many, like Art, saw fighting for the workers in Spain as part of the same struggle going on in the US, which was the international struggle. ALBA is pleased to offer programs free of charge, and this is only possible through the generosity of our donors. Please consider making a donation at the link, which you can find in the chat. Please note this event will be recorded. If you don't want to be recorded, just turn off your camera. After the presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions, at which time you can put your questions in the chat when the Q&A begins. Please wait for that time. And now I'm pleased to introduce Nancy Wallach. She is the daughter of Abraham Lincoln Brigade veteran Hy Wallach. She is a retired New York City public school teacher with a background in art education and professional development. She has received the New York City School and Culture Award and the Lincoln Center Institute's Creative Teaching Award. She has been named Art Educator of the Year by the New York City Art Teachers Association, United Federation of Teachers, and has received many grants in the areas of education and arts. She has represented ALBA at International Brigade and anti-fascist commemorations in Spain, England, Ireland, and France. She has delivered presentations on Paul Robeson and the International Brigade in Belfast and Dublin, where Paul Robeson was very beloved.
Thank you, Richard. Today, we're continuing the story of the Lincoln Brigade by putting the spotlight on one of the key figures in the history of the American labor movement and journalism, Art Shields. And in these times, sharing the lessons of the anti-fascist legacy of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade has a sense of urgency. These lessons from the Lincoln's legacy of resisting fascism and its connection to their roots in the trade union movement are nowhere better embodied than in the life and reporting of Art Shields, which is why we're so pleased to share Art's own accounts of those times and the lessons he drew from it in volume 2 of his autobiography, On the Battle Lines, 1919 to 1939. And the book begins with the Seattle General Strike to free Tom Mooney and concludes with Art's coverage of Spain for the Daily Worker. But the whole of the work, not only his reports from Spain, is aptly titled On the Battle Lines because the early history of struggles for unionization, which Art was a part of, were indeed battles in which workers' demands were often met with violent repression and literal battles took place. I think one of the best illustrations of the relationship between strong unions and anti-fascism comes from this conversation Art had with John L. Lewis, the head of the United Mine Workers, during the drive for industrial organization in the 1930s. Lewis had committed his union to solidarity with organizing drives with other unions. And in this interview, he says, "We will build a powerful labor movement that will have tremendous results in the political, social, and moral life of the United States." And Art asks him, "What of fascism? And will not the movement towards American fascism be weakened throughout the country when workers everywhere are organized as well as the United Mine Workers are?" Most assuredly, answered Lewis, "the best guarantee of democracy is a powerful labor movement." And at this point, it seems appropriate to point out that so many of the Lincoln Brigade volunteers came to Spain from the trade union movement that they helped to organize and return to after their service in World War II. Well, the entire program could be occupied by the list of Lincolns who came out of the labor movement. So we're inviting you to go to the chat room, and we invite you to add the names and trade union backgrounds of any Lincolns or International Brigade volunteers you know of or are related to. Thank you. And I'll share that of my own father, Hiawatha, who gave leadership in the shipping clerk citywide strike when 3,000 shipping clerks brought New York City's garment industry to a standstill until 500 different individual businesses and employers agreed to a settlement in 1937. Dennis, I'm not seeing any of the slides so far. Hart mentions members of the Maritime Workers Union who volunteered, and he says, "Seamen see more of the world than any other group of workers, and the nature of their job tends to make them internationally minded." So it was natural, therefore, that many of the members of the National Maritime Union, led by Ferdinand Smith, became volunteers in the Abraham Lincoln Battalion that fought against General Franco and his fascist butchers in Spain in the late 30s. And some of them, Art says, like Harry Hines, founder of the MWIU, left their bodies in Spain. Others, like Bill Bailey, Bill McCarthy, and Barney Brostoff, came back to fight for a workers' world in their native land. And according to ALBA board member Chris Brooks, at present, there are 375 seamen on the list of those who served in Spain. Well, the next slide is the grave marker for Art and Esther Shields at Forest Home Cemetery, which is just west of Chicago. And it's in the area surrounding the Haymarket Martyrs Monument. And the inscription, "Working Class Journalists," tells us all about their ardent commitment to an identification with the working class and how they understood their role as journalists. Art proudly tells how he worked on the Daily Worker's first issue, published on January 13th, 1924, and he would remain on the staff, including its successors, the Daily World and People's World, for the rest of his life. And their role of journalists was not, they were very much not false equivalency or both-sidism or whataboutism types of journalists. It's appropriate that they should be buried near the Haymarket Martyrs, as Art was involved in and used his journalistic and organizing skills in the many struggles for the 8-hour day. Art was an assistant strike organizer in the Brotherhood of Metal Workers campaign for the 8-hour day in Newark, New Jersey, and he termed this his first official union position. He says, "I wrote a number of strike leaflets. I replied to a speech by the publisher of the New York Ledger that said that strikers would not know what to do with their leisure if they toiled only 8 hours a day. And I polled many workers in preparing my reply to this time-worn nonsense. None had any doubt about what they would do with the spare time they were fighting to win." And in the style which Josie will give you many examples of later, he basically he polls the workers and he gives their responses to them and from them, everything from just resting from the punishing speed up. And he also wrote about how William Z. Foster organized the meatpacking industry and won the 8-hour day for 200,000 men and women. And I'd like to focus now on Art's reporting on the Battle of Blair Mountain, because it's often referred to as ground zero for the labor movement and the right to unionize in the 20th century. And battles were still going on around it as the owners rather, the owners seek to use it for fracking, while workers are using this commemorative site as a gathering place to push for 21st century demands. Well, Art entitles, as you can see in the slide, this chapter, War Correspondent. However, this assignment is not on the battlefields of Spain, which he'd report from in 1939. It's in West Virginia, 1921. And War Correspondent begins with these words: 5,000 Union miners were shooting it out with 5,000 gun thugs and state police on Blair Mountain in Logan County. Art calls it the biggest armed struggle in U.S. labor history. And this illustration, and they're done by Peggy Lifshitz in the book, he shows the murder of Sid Hatfield and Ed Chambers. And you may have seen Sid Hatfield's story told on the screen in the film Matewan, which is made by honorary ALBA board member John Sayles. Art calls this murder the spark that would start an explosion, the dramatic event that fixed workers' eyes on the crisis before the entire labor movement of West Virginia. And he says that spark flashed when Sid Hatfield was shot dead by Baldwin Falls assassins on the courthouse steps. Hatfield and Chambers, who was also killed, were falsely accused of blowing up a mine tipple in McDowell County, and they were promised protection by Bill Hatfield, the sheriff of McDowell County, a distant kinsman, if they came to Welch to answer the indictments. But blood ties meant nothing to Bill Hatfield. He was a U.S. Steel Corporation man through and through, and a hail of bullets met them as they reached the second round, the courthouse steps. And Art explains that this history of violence against the miners and their families, combined with the low wages and the unsafe work conditions, and what amounted to indentured servitude with a lifetime of debt, were all underlying contributions to the Blair Mountain uprising. Well, Art was not released to report on this until, in his words, the big battle began. And I was then in the midst of a war on the home front. And Art's reporting here, you'll see, has a lot in common with the way he would cover other labor conflicts and the war in Spain. He would put himself at great personal risks in order to get the truth out about the people's side, believing that injustice went unremedied because not enough people knew about it. And almost 2 decades before Martha Gellhorn would report on the Spanish anti-fascist war, he saw that his job, as she saw hers, was to be the eyes for his readers' conscience. After earning the trust of the miners, Art's given a guide, Ed, at Cabin Creek Youth, and Art says, "My only complaint was Ed wouldn't let me see all the action I wanted to see. Well, Bill told me you mustn't get hurt because you're a friend. 3 reporters are wounded already." But my complaint was short-lived. Ed couldn't keep out of the action himself, and I learned the strategy of both sides. Well, another feature of this conflict that future generations can draw lessons from is the diversity of what Art termed the workers' army. He notes that a Black man was one of the first men to die in this battle for miners' freedom. And he says he was reminded of Crispus Attucks, the first Black man to give his life for American independence in the Boston Massacre. Now, this working class army made significant history in the unity of Black, white, and multi-ethnic members. At the Battle of Blair Mountain, African-American workers, who in that time were frequently barred from union membership, were united with Hungarians, Italian, Polish, and Slavic workers in these tent camps, which you see, which were established because these workers had been evicted from their company homes for union activity. The mine owners tried to keep them apart in order to prevent organization and unionization, but it didn't work in Blair Mountain. And a very recent article in the Smithsonian magazine noted that one of the many bits of Blair Mountain history that continues to stick out is the diversity of the miners' army in 1921. Art uncovered plans for 13 of President Harding's U.S. Army planes waiting at Charleston Airfield, and they're loaded with gas and fragmentation bombs for use against the miners. He says the Battle of Blair Mountain ended without Army bombings. They did have bombings less lethal, although a couple of them were lethal, from the local authorities, but it ended without the US Army bombings when 2,000 US infantrymen arrived on Blair Mountain in full battle gear. Mother Jones called this US Army the Coal Barons Reserve Army of Gunmen. And here next you'll see a slide of federal troops arriving in West Virginia to put an end to the miners' protest, and 3 miners with a federal soldier preparing to surrender their weapons. That's the next slide. So that would be, let's go on to the next slide. There should be 3 miners there. And yes, and Art drew these lessons from the Battle of Blair Mountain. He said the strike wasn't won. All Union contracts in West Virginia mines were wiped out. Nevertheless, the question arises, was the battle worthwhile? And he says, very definitely. It left an example of solidarity and heroism that has inspired West Virginia miners ever since. The memory of Blair Mountain stimulated the miners in the big Union upsurge in the 1930s. They used different tactics. And men proudly said that their fathers, grandfathers, or uncles had been in the battle when I reported the historic Black Lung Strike victory in 1969. Well, the Mine Wars Museum marked that unity in the first Blair Centennial celebration in 2021. They concurred with Art's analysis. The Blair Centennial serves as a reminder, says the museum's director, Kenzie Mew, that solidarity is the only way forward. New labor and justice conflicts are emerging in West Virginia and throughout the nation. Blair Mountain teaches us we have to stand together if we're going to win. The miners took great risks and banded together collectively, overcoming barriers of race and ethnicity to shine a light on these dramatic examples of exploitation. And the lesson best learned from Blair Mountain is simple resilience. Today, union workers, their families, and activists of all stripes look back on Blair Mountain for inspiration about how to fight today's battles and for lessons on how to persevere. Perseverance, resilience, and unity. The story of the Lincoln Brigade has similar lessons for us. So from Art's reporting as a war correspondent at the beginning of the book, I'd like to jump to his work as a war correspondent in Spain, which concludes the book. The very last words Art writes in the book are, "The resistance to fascism by the Spanish people and the international volunteers left a glorious tradition of heroism and international brotherhood. And this tradition has inspired lovers of liberty ever since, and I'm proud I was accepted into the Abraham Lincoln Brigade." And the plaque, thank you, reads, "To Art Shields, honorary member of BALB, courageous war correspondent in Spain, valiant anti-fascist, 45th anniversary of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, April 18th, 1982. And I had the great privilege of sitting alongside Art and Esther as they joined my parents' table at many Lincoln Brigade reunions. And now that I've read his books, there's so much I would have liked to have asked them both. I would have liked to have heard about the third and unfortunately unrealized book he was planning. He intended to write about his encounters with and interviews with the cultural artists who supported the Lincoln Brigade, people like Paul Robeson and Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger. Art arrived in Madrid on Sunday, March 5th, 1939, after he had reported on the conditions in the French internment camps, which were already flooded with Spanish Republican refugees and International Brigade soldiers who couldn't return home to their fascist-occupied lands. He also reported on seeing hundreds of Soviet tanks and planes stockpiled at the border, which French Premier Delardier refused to allow over the border into Spain. And Art writes that had these arms been allowed to reach Spain, even at this late point, they could have made a big difference in turning the tide of the war in favor of the Republic. Art replaced Joe North as the daily worker correspondent during these very last days of the war. And the international brigades had already been dispersed. In Madrid, the Republican government of Juan Negrin and the Loyalist army was fighting off not only the advancing army of Franco's forces from his coup, but another coup within, led by Colonel Casado, who headed the Republic's army in Madrid. And Art was the only US journalist in Madrid during the Casado coup, and his reporting remains an important eyewitness account of it, which I'd like to share with you. Art relates this conversation he had with Emilio Delgado, who was the editor of the Communist Party national journal, Mundo Obrero. And Delgado said, "You've come at a dangerous time. We're expecting an armed uprising of the enemy's fifth column. We're expecting an armed uprising." And General Mola, one of Franco's commanders, once said that 4 fascist columns were marching on Madrid. And when they reached Madrid, they'd be met by a fascist fifth column inside the city. Art reported the Federation of Anarchists of Iberia newsletter contained the fifth column manifesto, their declaration. The signatures were headed by that of Colonel Casado, followed by Julian Vestiero, the right-wing Social Democrat leader, Miguel Sincender, a left Republican Party spokesman, the Trotskyite spokesman Pradas, Carrillo, and Garcia gave the manifesto their blessing, and the anarchists were Colonel Mera, Eduardo Val, and Gonzalez Marin. And Art says they did not call themselves the fifth column. They called themselves the National Council of Defense, but that was a misnomer because they were not defending Madrid, planned to give it away. And they promised a revolutionary peace with Franco after crushing the communists, and this was a lie. They were planning to surrender Madrid to Franco without firing a shot at the butcher, who had already executed 200,000 Spanish civilians. Art would be captured by a dozen of Colonel Mera's anarchists, and he describes some of them as wearing FAI emblems and all as carrying submachine guns. And he had the miraculous quick thinking and determination to escape from this cell for the condemned, which I think is the next slide. He avoided his execution, so we're very happy he was not executed. He's still with us. He led his captors, or he was still with us until 1988, I believe. He led his captors to the US Embassy, and he sprinted a few feet ahead of them in spite of hunger, exhaustion, and their best efforts to grab them back. The embassy custodian, who was an ardent Basque anti-fascist, told Art that Casado had executed 2,000 communists and alleged communists that past week, and he's sure Art would have been among them had he not escaped. Art would even be in further danger as he tried to get home, which he decided to do in order to get his stories out to work for the freedom of others who'd been captured, and he risked enemy attacks and recapture on the seas. Well, Art concludes this account of his escape, and I'm going to conclude my part now with the reminder, the very sober reminder that, quote, World War II was only 3 months away, and it must not be forgotten that the war might have been prevented if the United States had allowed the Spanish Republic to buy American arms. President Franklin Roosevelt once confessed that his Spanish policy was my biggest mistake, and few mistakes have been followed by so much bloodletting. And thank you for tuning in, and I'm going to send it back to you, Richard, now.
Okay, thanks, Nancy. That was very inspiring, hearing all about Art in those times. Our next presenter is Josephine Nelson Urich, the daughter of Lincoln vet Steve Nelson, who is considered one of the most popular leaders of the Lincoln Brigade. Josie is a former member of the Bronx National Organization, is a founding member, of the Bronx National Organization for Women and of the Tree Daycare Center. For 10 years, she served on the board of directors of the Lehman College Performing Arts Center. She's a retired New York City Public High School administrator and a longtime Valve and Alba associate.
Dennis, could you start the slides, please? You have just heard the excellent presentation by Nancy Wallach on Art's writing on the Spanish Civil War and some of the history that he witnessed. My presentation is going to focus on a slightly later time. I met Art in the fall of 1950 when he came to Pittsburgh to, I've lost the picture, oh dear. All right, Dennis, readmit me, or I am I can't see the slides. Okay, good. The slides, please. All right, now, I met him in the fall of 1950 when he came to Pittsburgh to cover the trial for the Daily Worker. Next slide, Dennis. He was well prepared for that assignment. Notice the Daily Worker began publishing Monday, 1924. Art's article is on the second page. "Hey, mister, let me see the strike paper," called a woman's voice from a travel-stained auto. "No one in my family ever scabbed," she continued. Next. As a result of that, Art was invited by Elizabeth Gurley Flynn to write a pamphlet on Sacco and Vanzetti. Next, good. Are they doomed? When I read it, I was shocked because it's not complicated. The writing is very simple, and Art was a college graduate. He could write a complicated sentence, but I understood after speaking to John Kalin, son of Clarence Kalin, vet, that John met Art in 1960 when he was preparing to write for a newspaper, and Art gave him advice. He said, "Always talk right as if the person is right in front of you." Next. And that's exactly what Art did. Here's an example. Old Timer tells how the NMU is born. That's how he structures the article, and he's telling the story of the maritime workers. Now, at this time, the content of the article really is saying that it would be okay to have a union if only the communists were thrown out. And ultimately, that is exactly what they did. Next slide, please. Another example of Art's writing. Murder Incorporated gangster runs scabs for the Harriman line. You may ask, where did she find all of these articles from the Daily Worker? Well, here I have to do a shout out to Fraser Ottinelli, because I was lamenting to him that I couldn't find the old DWs at Tenement. And he told me the stuff is all on the New York City Public Library online. So you can go and do the same research I did. You get connected and you can go through thousands of interesting articles. One of the things I would like to point out at this point is the story of Alan Johnson. I noticed that someone in the chat talked about his father organizing for the UE, Fasanella. Well, Alan Johnson fought in Spain, but in Pittsburgh, he became Alan McNeil, and he was an organizer for the UE. They went after this guy for a good 10 years. And here's my source is Peter Carroll, trying to take away his citizenship, because this was typical what they did to people who were not citizens and who were causing trouble. They went after their citizenship, and many people did leave this country because they were being hounded on this issue. Another vet, Lou Bortz, was active with electrical organizing in Pittsburgh. And later on, my research discovered that he was also arrested on a Trump charge. And this was the kind of vicious attacks they did on labor organizers in Pittsburgh. Okay, next slide. Now we have my father was arrested along with Andy Onda and Jim Dolson. The trial is going on, and Art actually becomes part of the news. There's a next, Over the weekend, the communist paper, the Daily Worker, accused Judge Mismano of a frame-up in pressing the case. Now, Art Shields wrote that Mismano was a witch-hunting witness. And Shields said Mismano has done his framing up from the witness stand and not from the bench. Meanwhile, he was drawing his $1,200 a month salary as a judge. At that time, remember, people were making $50 a week. And this kind of information was picked up by the Post-Gazette. And it occurred to me in retrospect that maybe the Post-Gazette was trying to get the Art's view out to the people of Pittsburgh. Of course, I'll never really know. Next, Dennis. Here, in my father's book, The 13th Juror, he's describing Margaret and Art entering the courtroom and how Art was witness to Miss Mano, where they had this big argument, which Art had described in the paper. Next. Art was seated at the table with other reporters from Pittsburgh. And my father felt sorry for him in this section because the guys he was seated with were members of these reactionary groups, and that Art had to sit with them. For example, the Americans battling communism. And by the way, they had television. We were on television. This trial was really covered by the papers on a regular basis, and Art had become the story. Next. Now, Art is now in Pittsburgh. My brother and I met him. I'm about 10, my brother's about 8, and Art is staying with us. And this is where I really got to know him, because Art had a son at the University of Michigan, Alan, and Art spent his time telling my brother and me about his son and giving us an encouragement as little kids. He really was quite nice to both of us. And he told us stories of Alaska. And to this day, my brother got interested in Jack London because of Art. Art also played games with us. And during this period, at one point, he gave me stamps from Germany to show how people from all around the world were responding to the campaign to free those who were in jail for sedition. And it was a very moving experience knowing Art, because he really kept our spirits up as little kids. Now, in this article, Art is describing Nelson being in jail, awaiting a jail decision. And it's a very, the jail, by the way, were called workhouses and asylums. That gives you an idea where Pittsburgh was in the 1950s. But the conditions in the jails were terrible, as Art describes. He's talking about bugs and terrible food. And also they put Steve in solitary, which meant he couldn't interact with the people. And if anybody knows him, knows he was a very social person. And this was really a very bad punishment to him. Now, at the same time, you see the fire destroying the office of the Pittsburgh Smith Act 5. Now, that may seem like a nothing, but actually it's typical of the danger that it was, that we were living under, that they were actually burning down the offices. At the same time that trial was going on, there were conferences where they were talking about, let's go lynch the commies. That was about 3 blocks away from the place where they were holding the trial. So it was a pretty violent period in Pittsburgh. And I do remember being afraid of the Ku Klux Klan when I lived in the suburbs, not in town. But the Ku Klux Klan was a threat in the 1950s in Pittsburgh. Now, on the same article where they talk about the Smith Act 5 office being destroyed, there's a little thing that says Clinton. Well, it's not Bill Clinton. They're talking about 12 Negro students being admitted to a high school in Clinton, Tennessee, because it gives you a picture of just how what conditions were like in the early 50s in this country. The next slide, please. Now, this is Jim Dolson. Now, Jim Dolson also lived with Bobby and me at a time, and my mother, of course. My father was in jail. Jim was out on bail. Now, he lived to 100, And Jim Dolson kept every article he ever wrote and probably every article he ever read. My brother told me that people used to call him Jim the Clipper as a joke. And actually, that's sort of what I remember about Jim were piles and piles of newspaper articles. Now, both Jim and Art wrote for the Daily Worker, but they couldn't be more different in temperament. Jim was a very shy person, withdrawn, didn't talk a lot. Whereas Art, as I've already described, and so has Nancy, was very talkative and charming. There's a picture of Jim in the center. Jim has the glasses. John Maternit was a lawyer who came from California. And Andy Onda is the next person. The next slide, please, is in the picture. Now, this was written by Art, and it describes Andy Onda and why he was attacked by Musmano and arrested. Onda had worked a 12-hour day as a 14-year-old in Jones and Laughlin, and he was an organizer in the union. He left for California, and then he came back in the late 40s, and they were not about to let people organize. Now, his car, I've discovered, was impounded in April of 1950. That's before the arrests. The arrests were in August of 1950 because of the books he had in the back seat. And that gives you a picture of just what Musmano and these people were trying to attack, these guys who were organizing. Next, please. Now we have Ben Crothers. Now, Ben Crothers was an organizer and a very successful organizer. There's a picture here of where he, of a union card from J&L in 1937. He went into those factories and he was able to get the population to sign into the unions. And that was why they were after him. There's the other picture is of Ben and my father and a lawyer looking at Ben's TB X-ray, because unfortunately he got tuberculosis during this trial. Now, I want to put this in perspective. I already talked to you about the segregated schools, but Pittsburgh in 1950 was a segregated city. We had segregated amusement parks, segregated skating rinks, and segregated pools. And one of my earlier remembers is in 1948, a guy named Nate Albertson, who worked at Westinghouse, helped integrate or attempted to integrate Highland Park swimming pool. He went there with a bunch of Black people. In those days, we would have called them Negroes. And they arrested the whole crowd. Well, 2 years later, Nate was given a 2-year jail sentence. And to this day, I recall this guy suffering because he tried to integrate a swimming pool. Now, just to give you, you've heard about Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson, they banned his singing, canceled his concert in Pittsburgh during the 50s. And ultimately, a Black church opened up and he was able to sing, and everybody went to sing him. My brother probably remembers that. My brother hopefully is watching this. But they were not about to let people like Ben Crothers organize, or people like Nate Albertson help to integrate in Pittsburgh. Next picture. Dennis, please. This I included because I mentioned, and it's another example of Art's writing. We had an automobile crash going to Philadelphia in 1951. We were going to raise money to pay for lawyers because, I haven't said it, but there was no lawyer in the state of Pennsylvania that would take these cases. The one guy who did, Hy Schlesinger, he got himself arrested. So this was kind of the vicious atmosphere in which these trials were held. And when we had this accident, Josie, who showed much calmness and presence of mind, telephoned her mother in Pittsburgh and her father's friends in Philadelphia at once. And it's a very nice tribute to me, and I it's an example of how nice art is. But on the same page, it says sedition trial prosecutor is running for district attorney. Well, that was their aim. They were all trying to become Masmano was running for lieutenant governor. These other people wanted to become judges. The next slide, please. The life and death of an evil law. By 1956, the Supreme Court of the United States threw out the sedition law in Pennsylvania because it ruled that state law is superseded by federal law. It actually made legal precedent. Now, in the article, Art talks about the history of the sedition laws and how it was initially used against the IWW seamen. And as early as 1919 in Pennsylvania, they had a whole series of vicious anti-union laws, and Art outlines them in this article. Next, yeah. This, here this is from the 80s. It's one of the vets events. By the 1980s, 900 people came to these events, and Art would have been there. And other people like Eleanor Holmes Norton and various other notaries would become there because it was a little freer time. And it was New York, it wasn't Pittsburgh. Next. This goes back to 1945, and thanks to Ray Hoff, who took it upon himself to digitize all of the old volunteers that his father had, and you can see all of this material online at the ALBA website. And these are tributes that people wrote to about Art, and I just included them to show the affection the vets had for Art. Next. Oh, I spoke about that. Keep going. Yeah. Firsthand history of labor. This comes from a Philadelphia paper, August 20th, 1983. And the last paragraph, it's a review of Art's book that had been recaptured from a Daily News New York review, and they reprinted it in a Philadelphia paper. But it said, Shields encountered a few notables along the way, but his vignettes and reminiscences about ordinary people make the book worth reading. And I thought that was a very nice summary of Art and how he reacted to people. Next. This is the gravestone which Nancy showed you. And when I found it, I was really happy because it said working class journalist. Notice it's plural. We haven't talked about Esther, but she was very much part of Art's life, and she was always at those vets events. And I knew her also in Pittsburgh. Now, I'm asking you now to send a contribution in Art's honor to ALBA. Honoring Art also honors all of those whose stories will be lost to history. We all know about the Hollywood 10 and Oppenheimer and how they suffered. But who's recording the story of the working people who sacrificed so much to fight for organized unions, the unemployed, and seniors during the 1930s and 40s? And as I read the chat, I saw that the people who were witnessing this today all really do understand the importance, because they all were connected to union people. The story has to be continued to be told. But ALBA is in the position as an organization to present that history if you want to hear it. So send some money, if not to honor a vet that you love, but send it to honor Art Shields. And that'll be a message that we want to hear more about the labor history.
Thank you, Josie, for that presentation. And yes, there is a link to donate to ALBA in the chat. Hello, my name is Dennis Meany. I'm the executive assistant here at Alba. This is the beginning of the Q&A portion, so I've been monitoring the questions you've put in the chat here. So I think it's time we can start with a few of them. For those who have joined our events before, the way this usually works is I've been watching your questions. Been recording them. I will call on you, so you have a chance to ask the panel your question yourself. If you don't feel comfortable doing so, I can ask that question for you. So, I'm going to call on, for instance, I'm going to call on one Colin Megamson now has a question regarding arts service in other theaters besides the Spanish Civil War. Colin, you can ask your question now if you'd like.
No, thank you both for a great presentation. And yeah, I just had a question if after Spain, if Art served as a correspondent during World War II or in any other military conflicts as he did in the last days of the Spanish Civil War.
Anybody? Nancy, I'm gonna unmute.
Well, I do know that he kept writing for the Daily Worker, which then became the Daily World, really up until his death. And as he mentions, even in the book, he reported on the Black Lung strike in 1969. Probably, if there is anybody here, from the Worker or the World, they would probably be able to give you more specific accounts of the other articles he wrote, but he did keep on reporting. So I'd be glad if anybody else had anything else to add about his reporting.
Okay. Well, thank you. I mean, hopefully if anybody does want to chime in on that, they absolutely can. Please put something in the chat and I will direct that to you. But thank you, Colin. While we're waiting on that, moving on, I believe Georgia Phillips had a question on more of a broad question on unions in America today. So Georgia, if you'd like to ask the panel your question, you can go and ahead and do so now.
Yes, I was just wondering if you people who are gathered here today feel that there's a correlation between the decline of the unions today and what's happening with politics in America and, well, other places. The rise of the right.
I could say a few words about that, or the other can, but yeah, of course. I mean, the union movement is one of the few movements that actually is an organized movement, or was an organized movement against corporate power and domination, and of course against fascism. And that was one of the things, of course, that happened in World War II. There was the ability of the left to really push back, whereas now the union movement has been so much decimated. It has also, since it's about labor, so journalism, all the journalism and newspapers have been pretty much decimated. Now the new rise of the union, which is very hopeful, is because the unions are people that can actually turn out people on the ground. They have a great facility to call people and get people to get on the phone. Next to maybe churches, for a while they were the one other organization that was really out there in the public, and now that they're gone, and the Republicans have been very great at working with churches and in a very, very conservative way. And I say the conservatives because I don't want to make it sound like all churches are like that. But so, yeah, I think it really does. Now, there is hope because now unions are reorganizing to a certain degree. We just saw the UAW actually endorse Biden, and Biden actually walked on a picket line. So without a doubt, I mean, they were the one thing that has been missing in the past. And of course, the Democrats and other people politicians have not been that great to the union movement or helped them. And legally, the union movement has also been very decimated in terms of the few recoveries that they got during the New Deal, which really just sent that the United States government would be neutral in struggles, whereas before the U.S. government was actually very anti-union, and they were used to crush strikes. But anyway, so yeah, I think you're right on with your question. I think people like art and people back then were much more politicized and understand the power of working people, and just working people as in general has been taken away, and it's been a very conscious campaign, which started in 1919 with the actually before that. I mean, with the American First program. I'm not American First. I'm sorry, the American program was called, which would essentially by William Randall Hearst and people like that, that would say that unions were not American and that America did not need unions. And so it's a very conscious program, and now we're just hoping that the rebirth of the union movement um, can take that back to a certain degree. Anybody, Josie or Nancy, do you want to say anything more about that?
I wanted to say just, I was looking in the chat room and there is a response to the prior question from Eric Gordon, who is a staff writer for the People's World. And he said he has available, he can comment on the availability of Art's other articles. So I just wanted to put that in.
Yeah. Eric, if you'd like to go ahead and see if you can shed some light on that question for us.
Yeah, thank you. What I think was not entirely clear from the presentation is that the People's World, which is the successor publication to the Daily Worker, is still being published. We're celebrating our centennial this year. But just a few days ago was the actual centennial, and we've been reprinting articles from the past to show how the Communist Party was always in the fight, and we've been highlighting the work of Art Shields. I'm not sure where Art Shields' papers are, his personal papers. They probably are in some archive, university or public institution somewhere. Maybe someone can enlighten me on that. I don't know. But the papers of the Communist Party and the papers of the Daily Worker and its successor publications are all at the Temament Library at NYU, which is also a big repository for ALBA materials. So there's, you don't have to even walk across the hall to to ask for materials on ALBA or the Communist Party or the Daily Worker. So now I am told that not every article is accessible throughout the entire 100-year history of the paper, but that some years have been digitized and and you can just find a name, with the snap of a fingers, and other years are not accessible. They have to be looked at, through the actual paper, which is kind of dangerous these days because that paper is yellowing and fragile and practically falls apart when you touch it. So I'm not even sure they allow people to, but it's a bit of a mixed answer that I'm giving. Some years are available and some not. There also were regional papers. I live in Los Angeles. The West Coast paper was called People's World, and later became the name of the paper in general. And some of those regional papers are digitized and some not. It's not a complete answer, I know, but it addresses that question.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. Really
Yes,
appreciate
I just want to interject. This stuff is all available at the New York Public Library online. The whole thing is searchable. All I did was put in Art Shields and I got hundreds of articles, and you can do a double.
Okay.
So it's there for you to use.
Thank you.
Great. Again, thank you, Eric, for that clarity there. Okay, yeah. So I'm looking at another question in the chat here, who from a Jason. Jason has a question sort of about today and the past. So Jason, you can ask your question now if you'd like. Okay, well, Jason, that's fine. This is why I'm just gonna go ahead and ask Jason's question to the panel. Does the panel have any opinion on, you know, kind of labor journalism today comparing to labor journalism under, like what the kind of work that Art did? So if anybody on the panel has an opinion about that, we'd love to hear it.
Well, Art did, obviously he worked for this thing called the Federation, which was a labor syndicate, which no longer exists. I mean, there used to be a lot of more labor journalism just in general. There was a labor beat in newspapers, and that's all gone. It's been destroyed. Papers in general have been gone. Most union papers are really sort of more vehicles for the officers, and they're requested to do them to make political announcements. So yeah, I think it's much less. Journalism today is just not what it used to be. I mean, there's things like labor notes, but they're all academic. They're more on an academic basis, and written for academics. I mean, one of the things about Art, he seemed to write for the people. He didn't write to sort of impress people about his greatness. He wrote to communicate. And that whole thing of journalism has been lost in a lot of ways. Whole thing of labor journalism and labor reporters. I mean, there's no longer labor reporters on the staff of newspapers, if there even are newspapers to the degree they can cover anything, which of course goes back to, you know, a plan, because they were one of the other things that stopped the right wing and the right. I noticed that John Kalin has his hand up, who his father was a major journalist as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, I think we do. I think actually we're coming up on time. But I definitely want to hear from John, who said he had a few anecdotes to express. So John, you should go ahead and speak to the panel and everybody now. There should be, yeah, perfect.
Okay, I'm unmuted.
Loud and clear.
Okay, so I just wanted to say that years back, Adelaide Bean introduced me to Art Shields. She was one of my mentors, along with Peggy Lipschutz. And I went to him in his in the office, and we had a very brief discussion, but I remember it as if it was yesterday. I was asking him, how do you communicate? What's the secret to your wonderful stuff? And he said, John, you're sitting at the breakfast table with a friend, and you're looking across the table at him, you're talking to him. That's the story. And that helped me write incredibly well after that, incredibly better after that. Also, because now when instead of writing an abstract comment, I'm thinking I'm talking to you, and this is how I would say it to you. The other thing is that when I opened the book, I was shocked. It says this book is deeply indebted to Adelaide Bean. Her influence is felt in every chapter. She knew when to expand, when to contract. Her judgment was invaluable. And that, to me, reminded me of a story I wrote in Labor Today about the invasion of Chile and the murder of Allende. I wrote it for Labor Today, and Adelaide said some very simple things to me, which were not provocative. They were not addressed to what I wrote exactly, but they're addressed to how I should focus my discussion. And I rewrote the piece and printed it in Labor Today. And the next thing I knew, it was put in the congressional record by a congressman from California. And it's one of the nicest pieces they ever wrote. So I was impressed by that, by Adelaide's knowing when to expand and when to contract. It's a good information for a writer. And I also see that the book has illustrations by Peggy Lipschutz, who is my other mentor. And of course, who was our designer for Labor Today magazine. I had some thoughts about labor. I don't know if we have time for that. I could something like to tell you about the New York Times. can I divert a little bit in this?
I think you could maybe just one more thing, and then we may have to wrap if that's all right.
Okay. In 1960 or so, I was a leader of the Social Service Employees Union in New York City in the welfare department, and we had been on strike illegally, and management made us an offer finally. The city of New York, Bob Wagner, and the deal was we would send the issues out to arbitration. If the arbitrator ruled in favor of the union, the company could reject it. If the arbitrator ruled in favor of the New York Times, I'm sorry, of the city of New York, then then we'd have to live by that decision. So we went to the New York Times and we said, because they were doing very bad journalism, as they always do on labor. And we showed them the documents. And the next morning, the headline of the New York Times editorial page was, "Union rejects binding arbitration." Of course, exactly the opposite of what was being offered. So this was an insight into how the New York Times conducts its labor objectivity.
Yeah, thank you, John. Appreciate you.
Dennis, before we wrap, I just saw a couple of hands up from two friends who were joining us from the International Brigade Commemoration Committee from Belfast, Linda and Ernest Walker. If we had time for a quick comment from them.
I think we'll do a quick well, first I'm just gonna, for order in which hands are raised, I'm just gonna go. I think Robert Nelson has something quick to say, then we'll end with Linda and Ernest, and I'm sorry we'll have to cut off question and comment at that point. I apologize to everybody else, but thank you for your patience. So Robert, if you'd like to say something briefly, please go ahead. You should be able to be prompted to be unmuted.
Thank you very much. Are you reading me?
Yes, loud and clear.
I want to thank my sister Josie for taking the lead on putting this talk together, and particularly on Art Shields. But there's a thought that I think I need to share with everyone who participates in this kind of group, is that Art and Esther represent for us, we who are alive today, a continuing link to the great revolutions of the last century, starting in the 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, but they also represent a continuing link to the revolutions that came out of the Great Depression, the Civil War in Spain, World War II, the Civil War in China, and the McCarthy period. And they all have relevance to interesting parts about the persecution of J. Robert Oppenheimer, which is now one of the movie that's selected to thought would be able to win all of the Academy Awards. And the attempt to smear Oppenheimer because of his sympathies for the Spanish Civil War cause was the cause of his persecution in Spain, including with his relationship with my father, Steve Nelson. But the part that's also significant about that is it gets to another part of the revolutions of that century, which also has controversy within people who are followers of this group. And that has to do with the Civil Rights Revolution of the United States, and particularly the role of Bayard Rustin, who was a Young Communist League member, as in his widely known movie. And the part that's the interesting connection, which I'd like to share with everyone, is let's remember that Bayard, for whatever agreements or disagreements we had with him over the years, that movie about Bayard Rustin was produced by the Obamas themselves. I think that's of great significance and worthy for us thinking about as making continuity back to the original revolutions of the last century. Thanks a lot for the right to comment, and I've enjoyed the play.
Thank you, Robert. Appreciate that. All right, and then Linda and Ernest Walker. I think this is all. This will be our last little question, but thank you again, Linda and Ernest. You can unmute and make your
Go
statement.
on ahead, Ernest.
Well, I'm not answering that.
There.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that greetings from Belfast, obviously, and it's been a very interesting discussion. But just to tell you that January 18th, we had 150,000 public sector workers on strike in Northern Ireland. Now, that might not seem a lot in United States terms, but when you consider that the population of the North is less than 2 million people, it's a fair amount of workers. The money is available to pay these people, but the British government says it's not within their gambit to pay. That is up to the devolved government. But we have not got a devolved government. We have not had a government for 2 years because one of the major parties will not has boycotted the assembly. So the money's available, but the workers can't get their hands on deserved pay rises because we have not got a devolved government. There will be more strikes taking place, and there has been strikes taking place throughout Great Britain, by the way. In every sector, there has been strikes taking place because of the cost of living. And I'll just finish on this. There's just been a program on our television, Channel 4, on the question of the British miners' strike. It's 40 years since the miners' strike took place, 1984. And the defeat of the miners in that strike was a watershed for the British and Irish trade union movement, as far as we're concerned. Thank you for letting me speak on that.
I just want to say that we produce this newspaper, so we do newspaper every week, and sometimes we carry some of the articles from your newspaper.
Wonderful.
So thanks very much.
Well,
I don't know which way round it is, but anyway, that's unity it's called. Thanks very much.
We see it. Thank you so much for that, and we wish all the workers in Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom solidarity, I'm sure, right? But thank you. Okay, so again, thank you. I have to cut off. I have to cut off time now. But again, thank you everybody for coming to our event on Art Shields. We really appreciate it. All of you attending. We do have an event calendar on our website. If you enjoyed this program, you may in fact enjoy some of our other programs coming up in this year of 2024. Also, this session we were just in will be recorded and put on our YouTube page, which is located at that link I just provided. You'll also receive, likely tomorrow, a evaluation email just saying, kind of a Google form saying, did you enjoy the program? What didn't you like? What did you like? And within that will contain a link to the YouTube link to this video, so you can watch it again and share it with your friends and family who weren't able to attend and watch it. And as well, you can view our back catalog of all of our events that have been online for the past 4 or 5 years. So I encourage you to do that and share that widely. Great. As you can, and we are a nonprofit educational organization. You can in fact donate to ALBA at this link here. We would very much appreciate if you could spare what you can. This is where you do the work to keep the memory of the Lincolns alive and use and share their anti-fascist actions as a way to educate youth and people at all levels of educational development about what our country, what we've done and what can be possible in the future through their example. So I will quit talking. Again, thank you to Nancy, Josie, and Richard for your work on the panel here. Really appreciate it. Yeah. No pasaran, as everybody here, I believe, likes to say. And have a great rest of your day, everybody, or night, depending on if you're one of our European friends.